Okay, thank you so much for coming to my talk. My name's Eric. I'm presenting my work, Understanding and Improving Security and Privacy in Multi-User Smart Homes, a design exploration and in-home user study. This is work I did with my advisor, Franzi Rosner, who was very helpful and did a lot of work on this project. So smart homes are an increasingly popular technology. Some estimates say that 33% of households in the US already have some sort of internet-connected smart home device, which includes things like smart speakers, like the Amazon Echo, smart locks, smart thermostats, smart lights, you name it. But in the security and privacy community, we have a lot of concerns about smart homes because they collect a lot of privacy-sensitive information about what people are doing at home. And if they're misused, they can really negatively impact the physical security of the people in the home and also the physical environment of the home. And when it comes to smart home security and privacy, there's a number of angles that we can look at. One is network and embedded system security. So many smart home devices, especially older devices, have serious vulnerabilities, which could allow remote attackers to steal private information or to hijack the devices for use in botnets. Another big concern is data privacy and surveillance. There's a lot of concern about the manufacturers of these devices because they can collect a lot of data about what's happening in our homes, and we're not sure exactly what is being done with the data and how securely it's being stored. But today, I want to talk to you about multi-user security and privacy, which is how a user's security and privacy might be impacted by the other inhabitants of the smart home. And I'll illustrate what I mean by this with a few examples of tensions and conflicts within smart homes that stem from security and privacy-related issues, which we found in a lot of the related work on smart homes. So first, the data collected by the smart home can be used to violate other people's privacy. In prior work, people have reported feeling a sense of loss of privacy when they know that other people in the house are using the smart home to track what they're doing, or when information about what they were doing at home was unintentionally exposed by the smart home software. Second, the smart home can be a focal point of broader conflicts in the household. So maybe one common example is that people have been passively aggressively changing the thermostat back and forth just from their phones because they don't want to talk about it, but they disagree strongly about the temperature. Another is that parents and teens will disagree about surveillance policies for the front door. So should the camera track who's going in and out, as sort of a broader conflict over freedoms and curfews for teenagers. And lastly, there's often imbalances in who has power and who has access in the smart home. We typically see that there's one person who's very excited about setting up the smart home, and they have all the accounts, they have the passwords, and most importantly, the knowledge of how the smart home works. And they can leverage this power and access to restrict other people from using the home or otherwise behave badly. And it contributes to some of these privacy issues and conflicts in the home. So hopefully that gives you some idea of the challenges in designing smart homes to meet the needs of multiple users in the home. But unfortunately, most modern smart home platforms don't deal with these issues in a very sophisticated way. For example, the Samsung SmartThings platform doesn't have any support for multiple users beyond having one account for each user. There's no permissions model or anything in that platform. Apple HomeKit is marginally better in that they have remote access permissions and editing permissions for the home configuration. And what's very popular now is the Amazon Echo and Google Home, which you can use for voice commands in the smart home. But these don't really support voice-based authentication, so any guest or person just shouting through the open window might be able to control your smart home. So given the shortcomings in this space, we sought to answer two big questions in our research. First, we wanted to investigate more intentionally what are the range of multi-user security and privacy challenges that smart home users face in the real world. And second, we wanted to concretely investigate how should a smart home be designed to address multi-user security and privacy challenges. And to investigate these questions, we did two things in tandem, like the subtitle of our paper suggests, a design exploration and an in-home user study. So starting with the design exploration, our goal was to develop and evaluate design principles to address multi-user security and privacy issues in smart homes. And so we came to a set of principles that we derived from prior work, but then we take it a step further by building out these principles in a concrete prototype and then experimentally assessing the principles in an in situ study. And so this in-home user study also served the dual purpose of surfacing new perspectives on multi-user security and privacy in smart homes. Because unlike interviews and surveys, which rely on users' prior experience with existing smart home technology, which already does not support multiple users very well, we could elicit much richer data by putting something concrete in front of them with concrete security and privacy features. All right, so to start, I want to talk a bit about the threat model of our research. So the multi-user security and privacy issues that I mentioned earlier can often vary in intensity and severity. So we might see that in most households, people might experience these issues as minor annoyances or things that make them a bit uncomfortable in their homes. But in the extremes, these issues might manifest as smart home-enabled domestic abuse or intimate partner violence. For example, there's a great article in the New York Times this year about how abusers can use smart homes to harass, disorient, or otherwise spy on the people that they're abusing. And so designing smart homes to prevent this type of abuse from occurring is a really difficult problem because we're talking about adversaries that live in the same home, they have physical access to all the devices, and they control the smart home. And so we decided that in our research, we were going to focus on generally cooperative households in the general case, which we still think is important because today's smart homes barely have scratched the surface of what can be improved for the general case. But I still want to highlight that it's really important to investigate how to design smart homes that can support and protect people experiencing abuse in their homes. With that in mind, I want to propose a few design principles from improving multi-user security and privacy in the smart homes of generally cooperative households. We conducted a systematization of prior work on smart home security, privacy, and usability. And based on the problems and recommendations that they made, we hypothesized that smart homes should be designed to support access control flexibility, transparency of smart home behaviors, user agency, and respect among users. And since there's not a lot of time in my talk, I will just be focusing on these last two for the rest of the presentation. So particularly user agency we think is important to promote because smart homes often take things that were easily accessible in the physical world, and then when you make them smart, you sort of lock them behind technology, and it can make it harder for novice users to understand and access, and so, which can lead to some of the power imbalances that I described earlier. We also think that smart homes should be designed to promote respect among users because to try to minimize the conflict between users and to also discourage inconsiderate types of behavior. So we built a prototype smart home app that embodied some of these principles. It's called Smarter Home, and it's a mobile app that lets you control a Samsung SmartThings system. And we implemented a suite of access control and notification features based on recommendations from prior work. And I'll very briefly describe how some of these features relate to our broader principles. So first, towards our goal of promoting respect among users in the smart home, we implemented a few features that could help enforce respectful usage of the home. First of all, we had location-based access controls. So one possible use case for this, among others, is you can use it to prevent people from outside of the home from controlling from surprising, startling, or annoying you when you're at home by remotely controlling the devices around you. Another feature we implemented were activity notifications, which notify you when a device's state changes. And it can also tell you exactly who is doing this change or if it was done by some sort of app or automation in the smart home. And so if someone's remotely using the smart home in some inconsiderate way, you can immediately tell who's responsible and start a conversation about it. And then we have traditional role-based access controls. These can be used for things like setting up parental controls or restrictions on guests, but also for, you can do things like preventing other people from accessing devices in private spaces like your bedroom. We also implemented a few features that could help support user agency. So one of them is supervisory access control. And so the idea behind this is like if you are a parent and you want to give your child to explore how to use technology, use parts of the smart home, but you want to be able to supervise them from doing it. So it'll block, basically this will block the child from doing things when you're not around, but then if you're like in the same room to supervise, it'll give them access. Another feature we have is reactive access control. So this lets users ask another user for permission where they would normally be denied access, which might be useful if there are edge cases where access control rules might be too strict and too restrictive. Lastly, we implemented discovery notifications. So this is a type of persistent notification that shows up in your notification center. It shows which devices are near you and what their state are. And so if you're not familiar with how the smart home works, you really have an easy reference to see what devices are smart, and making that a lot more visible. So with their prototype built, the next step was to evaluate it as part of our in-home user study. And so I'll describe how we did this. So first, we started by recruiting participants via ads on Facebook. They filled out a quick survey, and then we would call them up to screen them, and then would select a few of these participants based on their perceived commitment level and also their household composition. Once we selected a household to participate, we would have them choose which smart home devices that they wanted to use for the study. They were not required to already own a smart home, and we would purchase devices if necessary. So once these devices were shipped to them, we would have an in-home session where we would conduct an interview and then help them set up their devices. They would use the devices over the course of 4 weeks before we followed up with them at the end to get their reactions and feedback. And I should mention this protocol was also approved by our university's institutional review board. We ended up recruiting 7 households in total with 19 participants. We strove to have a diversity of different household types, so we have roommates, couples, families with children. Most of them did not already own a smart home, and we got them to use a pretty big variety of different smart home device types. Okay, so now I want to talk about the results of our study. So again, since I'm short on time, I want to just focus on a few findings related to our design principles of promoting respect among users and user agency. So first, we found that access controls were used to establish rules for appropriate usage in a few specific use cases. And these included location restrictions on visitors, restrictions on devices in bedrooms, parental controls, and then restrictions on modifying the smart home's configuration. There's one funny example of this where of the configuration permissions where I asked a participant who programs and controls the smart home, and then the wife said, "It's all me." And the husband said, "She programs it and I break it." And she said, "That's why he's not allowed to have admin control, read-only access." And then later when we were setting up Smarter Home, she actually set him as the child role because that would lock him from messing up the configuration. But outside of those specific cases that I just mentioned, we found that especially among the regular members of the household, respectful usage of the home was guided much more by social norms than the features that we had provided them. So among couples, roommates, and also parents with kids, we saw that they all often trusted each other enough that they didn't need to use any sort of access control. When I asked this participant about whether she wanted to use parental controls for her son, she said, if my son were a different person, I might not have given him permission to turn off the alerts for the windows and the doors. But as it is, he follows rules exactly, so I was not worried about it. But if he had been me, if I were him as a teenager, I would have turned off my own permissions. So another example of norms regulating behavior around privacy is that a few of the tech-savvy participants were aware that they could violate the privacy of others in their home by listening to their Amazon Echoes logs or by looking at the camera feeds. But when we asked directly about it, they reported that they chose not to do this because they didn't find that it was acceptable. Another interesting aspect that we found about the influence of norms on behavior is that there were certain norms that carried over from the physical home or the dumb home that were applied to the smart home. So for example, participants generally didn't have access control preferences for devices in common spaces, like lights or door locks or things like that. We asked a family about setting location-based access controls on the lights, and the mom said, I don't think we had a need for them not to. It's kind of open. In the past, they could control them manually. We saw a related phenomenon in the reactions to notifications. So we were worried that these activity notifications could harm privacy by revealing information about people's activities that they wouldn't have learned otherwise. But participants found that they didn't really learn anything that they couldn't have learned by being physically present in the space and noticing it. Lastly, I want to touch on some difficulties that we faced with supporting user agency. So we found one issue that we discovered was that our access controls often interfered with other use cases that people had in the home and opted not to use them. So when we asked one participant about location-based access controls, they said that I want to be able to turn things on and off when I'm not at home, because that's sort of a benefit of having smart devices, right? It's when you're not present, you can still be present in some ways. Another issue that came up was that the UI for our access controls were fairly complicated, despite my best efforts to make them usable. And it meant that most participants didn't end up setting up these access controls outside of our guided setup sessions. So they may not have been able to actually implement rules that they might have found useful. All right, so moving on to the discussion. The big takeaway we got from these findings, I think, was that among our participants, positive household dynamics are probably the biggest factor in preventing multi-user security and privacy issues compared to the features that we provide in the prototype. In particular, we observed that our participants had high trust relationships. They had existing positive norms in their homes. They were very communicative about how they use the smart home. And they benefited from having a researcher-facilitated setup session. And so I think it's important to note that not every household will be as harmonious and cooperative like the ones that we recruited for the study. But I think an interesting question to ask is how might we design smart homes to help scaffold and develop these positive dynamics in other households? And so this leads me to the recommendations from our work. So first, I think a very promising direction for future research is to study whether smart homes can promote social norms that positively impact multi-user security and privacy. So one idea we had for this is to have apps and devices encourage households to have a meeting when setting up the home where they can learn about how it works, and to set expectations and norms about using the home. Another idea is that instead of having strict access control rules, we could have the home automatically detect when people might be acting inconsiderately and tell them, hey, maybe don't do that. We also recommend that smart homes use existing smart homes incorporate some basic multi-user features that are usable, like access controls and privacy controls. And lastly, I just want to call back to what I brought up earlier in the talk, which is that designers of smart homes should consider how to provide better protection and safety for people who live in smart homes and are experiencing some sort of abuse. So with that, thank you all for listening. There's a lot more that I didn't have time to talk about that's in the paper, but I want to thank my advisor, Franzi, for all the work she put into supporting me and working on this project, to my lab for moral support, and also to our participants who very graciously invited to our home and very helpful. And with that, I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Boke from the University of British Columbia. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was helpful. I was very curious on why you didn't decide to use participants who were currently using smart home devices or participants that have reported facing challenges, because you mentioned that most of them didn't find this useful. They just wanted to do the social norms. So if people were already having challenges doing this and then they used your prototype, do you think that would have helped them in deciding if it was useful or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the reason why we did that is that we wanted to avoid biasing our participant pool to early adopters of smart home technology, who are generally much more tech savvy and would make more use of access control features like that. And we wanted to make sure that the things that we were building were also accessible to people who are more novice users and were less experienced with the technology. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Mohammed. I'm from University of California, Irvine. I have a question about the implementation of this idea. How do you differentiate between different users, especially when they use an audio activating device like Alexa?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's actually something that came up in our study. Our implementation basically tied each particular user to to their smartphone. And one big problem is that if you used Alexa and Amazon Echo or Google Home, you could actually sidestep the access controls entirely because these are not tightly integrated with our system and with smart homes in general because of the way they authenticate. So that's actually a big problem, and those types of devices should be better integrated with smart homes in general.
Thanks.
So to not keep everyone from lunch, I'd like to encourage the last few question askers to get in touch with Eric now after the session. And I just want to thank everyone for coming to the session. Cheers.